Welcome to this video lecture on Native American history dealing with the federal government and federal government policies. This is going to give you a broad context about what it was like for Native Americans in dealing with the United States. This is especially going to give you some history on how Native Americans dealt with American colonists going through to the development of the United States country and then eventually to federal policies. So we're going to start off with the early pre-Columbian history. That's before Christopher Columbus shows up. And at that point, what we see are not Native Americans, not American Indians, but rather tribes and kingdoms. The way I like to call it is basically a group of nations that interacted with each other just like nations did around the world. Now, at the time, they had to adapt to numerous parts of their environment. That included, for example, up in the northeast of the Americas, the Iroquois Confederation. It was a group of Native American tribes that joined together in order to stop wars, start to do trade, and to deal with the local area of the Ohio River Valley with all of its major irrigation areas. Out in the southwest, you had a desert environment, and there a group of people called the Chaco or the Pueblo actually built whole cities out of rock in order to survive the desert environment. Or take the Aztecs. The Aztecs who settled down in the Mexican desert basically had no water in that area, or very little, right? So what did they form? They formed these huge wooden structures to collect water, and out of that they created what are called the chinampas. This was a way to create what was known as the hanging gardens, and this eventually fed over 2 million people in their empire. Or take the Incas in the Andean Mountains at one of the highest points on Earth. There they were able to establish projects to build roads and highways and to develop one of the strongest empires of that area. Natives basically had a number of different ways of adapting to their environments, and they created a whole bunch of different types of cultures to this as well. Their commonality was they tended to live in community. They tended to believe in the importance of nature and that spirits lived within nature, or something known as pantheisms. Now, out of that, oftentimes we hear different stereotypes about Native Americans. The one that's been classical for a long time is that Native American groups were barbarians who lacked culture, they lacked religion, they lacked government. More recently, we've kind of gotten that stereotype, but they were sort of like the peaceful hippies of the 1960s. Neither of these were very true. The better way of looking at Native Americans leading up to the time of European contact was that natives acted like anybody else around the world in the sense of nations, acting together, interacting together with wars, treaties, and trade. Now, eventually, we do have the Europeans are going to come over, and we get a colonial response to the natives. When the English came over and had to deal with the natives, they were dealing with them as nations, and the natives dealt with the Europeans as nations. That meant that there was a checking and balancing going on, as always takes place. Different Native American tribes, different Native American kingdoms played off the different major European groups. We had major wars that took place. For example, Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War, is when American colonists started going out into the Ohio River Valley, and the Massasoit Indian fought back. And they were able to stop the Americans from going too far out into the Ohio River Valley. But that all stops with the French and Indian War. It was at that time, in the 1730s and 1740s, that the French were kicked out of the region. This was actually a huge problem for Native American tribes. Why? Because now there was one major European power on the East Coast, the English, and there was no one to play off of that. After that, the Americans become their own country. After the Revolutionary War. And it's that point that we see one major last effort to fight against the Americans coming into the Ohio River Valley, and that's the War of 1812. Two leaders of the Indians of that time period, Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, tried to interact and tried to stop the Americans from what they were doing, but because there really was no one to check and balance against the Americans, this was no longer a possibility. So now let's get into the American federal policy. And the American federal policy is going to change over time. We tend to think of the American federal policy as sort of like unified, right? That the idea was Native Americans were just pushed out, but it wasn't that simple. For a long time, it looked like Native tribes would be able to hold their own. The problem was, once the American government became centralized and strong, it became very difficult without any other power there for the natives to play off and do that checking and balancing. Now, the American federal government treated Native Americans as sovereign nations, but under American authority. A good example of this was with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson at first treated the Cherokee Indian as their own nation in Georgia, but as the Georgians found gold in that area, they petitioned Andrew Jackson to remove the Native Americans, which he set up the foundations to happen under what was called the Indian Removal Act. Now, he was not the one to do it. It actually came up with the next president, but when that happened, Native Americans were removed out to Oklahoma. Now, the Cherokee Nation did appeal to the U.S. government to stop this. They did so in two major Supreme Court cases. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in which at the time the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, ruled that natives were not really separate but dependents on American authority, and so because of that they had no authority to tell the American government what to do. But then in Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall said, no, you can't move these guys. Now, you might think, there you go, right? The American government protecting native rights. No, it wasn't that simple. In fact, in Worcester versus Georgia, the only thing John Marshall really was ruling on was to say that Georgia was trying to move these people, and they didn't have the authority to do it. Only the U.S. Congress had the authority to do it. That gave Andrew Jackson and his predecessors all the ability to basically remove Native Americans, which is what they did in the Trail of Tears, in which over 1/3 of the Cherokee died as they were moved in the dead of winter. After this, we get into the Civil War. And when the Civil War took place, at the end of that, the federal government was strengthened and wanted people to move out west. And when they did, they began fighting against Native Americans in that area, especially in what were known as the Sioux Wars. In those wars, a group of different Native American tribes joined together in a confederation called the Sioux and tried to stop the federal government from pushing them out of this area, but they eventually failed in that effort. That allowed for what was known as the reservation system, in which American Indians were placed upon areas of land. And these areas of land were supposed to be areas that would protect these Native Americans and give them their own sovereign nations. But it's really not what happened. Instead, there was a reform movement in order to make Native Americans more like us. This was known as the allotment system, or the Dawes Allotment Act. In the Dawes Allotment Act, natives were supposed to be allotted certain amounts of land, and then they were supposed to farm that land based upon the values of being an American. The idea of being an individual, of having patriarchy, and mass-producing crops for the marketplace. Well, eventually this broke down pretty massively, and the reason why was a number of different reasons. Number one was Native American culture. Native Americans, as we talked about at the beginning, were communal. Trying to have them live in nuclear families off on their own really destroyed their overall value system and their connection with one another. That eventually led to massive problems of alcoholism and depression. But there's more to it too. While the Dawes Allotment Act originally allowed Native Americans to have their own land, basically what it did was it allowed for a lot of the land to be bought up by Americans themselves and American companies. So what the Native Americans tended to be left with was pretty poor land. That eventually led to a particular Native American, a man named Wovoka, who attempted to create something called the ghost dance. This was based upon previous traditions of trying to resurrect or appeal to the ancestors of Native Americans. And he promised the Sioux Indian that if they did this, their ancestors would come and protect them. Well, finally, at one point on the Pine Ridge Reservation, these Native Americans were rounded up by the American cavalry at a place called Wounded Knee. And while they were there, the American cavalry started to take away their weapons. On one of these occasions, one of the American officers went up to a man and tried to take his weapon, and he wouldn't give it away. And so they figured this was probably like rebellion, resistance. Actually, the man was deaf and didn't understand what the directions were. That led to somebody firing a gun, and then the American cavalry opened up fire and killed over 100 men, women, and children who were part of the Sioux Indian at the massacre at Wounded Knee. So this sets up our context for what we're going to see in the 20th century. By the time we got to the 20th century, or the 1900s, the policies had moved from natives being seen as having their own sovereign nation, natives being dependents, natives being moved onto reservations, and then natives being forced into an assimilation pattern into the United States and the federal government policies.